in the Participatory Grantmaking Community, which is a voluntary run community of people, organisations, funders, non-funders, consultants, researchers, students, people with an interest in participatory grantmaking and how we shift power to communities. It's a lovely space, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about it now before we kick off with our speakers. So as I say, it's a broad church. We've got all sorts of people involved in the community, all across the globe. So when you're involved in our events, you'll often meet people from various different time zones, backgrounds, geographies, organisations, and it's just a really nice space to engage with others exploring the topic. We do run it voluntarily. I'm very tired, and we try and provide as much open source information as possible to the collective. So you can find loads of resources about participatory grantmaking on our website, including all of our upcoming events that are all free to engage, and you can join our community. So if you're interested in joining our mailing lists or our Slack groups, you can do that through the website. The mailing list is really interesting. We have battled with this and gone backwards and forwards. It's non-hierarchical. We didn't want it just as a broadcast message. So once you join the email messaging, you can message everybody on it, and they can message you, which makes for occasional flurries of lots of emails and occasional quiet periods where there are not so many emails. You can manage those settings through Google so that you don't get inundated, but it's a wonderful place to ask questions and receive wisdom and knowledge from people within the community. Involve yourself in discussions, debate, learning. It's good fun. And then each month we host our Tuesday club and our Thursday club. The first Tuesday of every month and the first Thursday of every month. These are peer learning spaces. You can come meet other people doing participatory grantmaking, come with your challenges, successes, frustrations, questions, and join a collective conversation to unpick and explore what they could be. We then also hold sessions like this around a deeper dive, so looking at a particular topic or issue towards, that's the wrong word, that's my COVID brain, around participatory grantmaking. You can find all of those on our website, and we do make sure all of those are open source, so everything that we do goes up on our website, so you can find hours of content about participatory grantmaking if it's something that fascinates or interests you. So coming up, we've got a session on the 23rd of June, looking at how organisations fundraise for participatory grantmaking. So within the organisation, we've got some, within the community, we've got some amazing organisations who fundraise to distribute to communities, organisations like Red Umbrella Fund, Disability Rights, Camden Giving, lots of amazing organisations. They're in discussion about how they leverage in more money into their communities. We've got our next peer support sessions on the 5th and 7th of July, and the second session of this collection with Ford Foundation looking at participatory grantmaking and the impact on community movement building on the 16th. We offer lots of stuff for you, most of which I've gone through, but as I say, we are voluntary run. You can get involved, you can help build community, blog, speak, host, write, share or volunteer with us. If you're interested, do let us know. You can contact us on the website or through many means. I'm sure Elena is sticking some things in the chat. And you can also fund us. So if you are interested in donating to the community, you can do that online through our online account system. And finally, feedback is the breakfast of champions. We don't get better at our work unless we hear from you guys about what you are interested in learning about or exploring, what's gone well or what's gone terribly on these webinars. The QR code has made a fantastic comeback, but we'll also stick the link in the chat. Please do provide feedback on how you found the session. So that's my very quick intro to the community, but I'm going to step back now and pass over to the wonderful speakers today who will be sharing their learning. Go on, Cindy.
Hey there. I have the honor of introducing our speakers, but I wanted to say hello and welcome to everyone. Just a couple things before I introduce the speakers. First of all, I invite everyone who's on the call to introduce yourselves in the chat. And we also have a poll for everyone to take to get a sense of where this group is in terms of their participatory grant-making journey. And that link is in the chat as we speak. So if everyone would click on that and take a look. So here's the scale. It's 1 to 5. If your organization is in the exploration phase, you would click 1. If you are in the we're making the case phase, you would click 3. And if you're already moving into some kind of implementation, you click 4. And if you are doing participatory grant making already in some form, you would click 5. So Shanice, if you could show me the results. I don't know where they are. Okay. Any results?
Yep, gonna go ahead and share my screen right now.
Excellent.
Take this up.
Okay, so we have, wow, this is interesting. We have the majority of responses in the implementation phase. I actually think that's not surprising. It's interesting because it's not a response that we would have seen perhaps 4 or 5 years ago. Probably 4 or 5 years ago, we've probably seen much more skew to the left-hand side of that graph. It was actually about 4 or 5 years ago, just to give some context for today's conversation, that I met with Chris Cardona at the Ford Foundation to explore participatory grant making. It seemed to be getting a lot of traction, which was largely due to a group of participatory grant makers who were members of the Human Rights Funders Network. Chris was interested in pulling together a lot of information and threads that were floating around about participatory philanthropy and tried to nail down a clear rationale and theoretical framework for the approach. Ford then supported that research, and then and a monograph that summarized it, and then subsequently they funded the grant craft that hopefully you all have seen, and if you haven't, go to Candid and download it. It features the insights and wisdom of 30 plus participatory grant makers around the world, and how this looks in real life. When those publications were done, Chris and I were talking, and he said he didn't think that Ford could do much more because they were a very large legacy foundation, and clearly that is very difficult for those foundations to jump into participatory grant making immediately. So I understood that completely, but as we were talking, I said, well, there actually is something you could think about supporting, and that is the infrastructure behind what was then a very fledgling field. And as we know, or hopefully we know, a part of strong infrastructure for any field is research. And research is something that's really hard to get funding for, even though funders say they want evidence and they want data. So, and I will say this community of practice is another example of infrastructure that funders could fund and support as well. So Chris liked the idea. He got some funding for the research, and so in discussions about how we would do the process, we said, let's walk the talk and let's make this whole research funding process participatory rather than staff and Ford Foundation doing it in a more traditional way. So we did. So a panel of grant makers who were not part of the Ford Foundation that came up with a slate of grantees that were incredibly diverse across a lot of variables. And I think Chris would probably agree, may have been different than what would have happened if the Ford Foundation had done this in a traditional way internally. I wanted to tell this story because I think it underscores that funders who aren't able to do participatory grant making yet can support this work in other ways and get the kind of results they want to see. And you're going to hear about some of those results today, which features 3 speakers. So first we have Emily Finchum-Mason from the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at Washington University. Emily was part of a team of researchers that included David Suarez and Kelly Houston, also from the University of Washington, who conducted one of the first national and rigorous studies of whether and to what extent participatory philanthropic approaches were being used by America's largest private and community foundations. We're also happy to have Elizabeth Barajas-Román here today from the Women's Funding Network. It is the largest global alliance of women's funds and gender equity funders in the world. Some of you may not know this, but women's funds were actually one of the pioneers of participatory grant making, but there had been relatively little documentation of the current practice and its evolution over the last decade. So Elizabeth's work is helping to fill that gap with some interesting findings that you're going to hear about. And finally, last but not least, we have Chris Cardona from the Ford Foundation, who can give a little bit more detail about the research process, funding process, as well as offer his own experiences and insights about participatory grant making. So take it away.
Great, I'm happy to get us started. Thank you so much, Cindy, for that great introduction. What I'll focus on is sort of how this, for the Ford Foundation, what the motivation for this work was, and then talk a little bit, as Cindy said, about the process that we used to get to it, because it was really an example of trying out a participatory approach within a larger legacy foundation. And I'll say too that it's really exciting to be at this stage in the process because it has been, a number of years in the making. So what I would say is when I joined the foundation in 2015, it was really to our philanthropy sector portfolio in the US. And the problem statement that we hit upon was that the quality of relationships that funders form with grantees and communities is fundamental to the impact that they're able to achieve. But too many funders have too great a distance between those making decisions and those about whom decisions are made. Therefore, we set as an aspirational goal to close that gap between philanthropic decision makers and the lived experience of those most affected by inequality through deeper inclusion among the staffs and boards and through external stakeholders. So really saw it as two different approaches to the same goal: internally through pursuing diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies within foundations, so funding research and convening and community and standard building on that topic, using an intersectional lens to encompass multiple different forms of inclusion, and then externally by engaging outside stakeholders as co-creators of a foundation strategy or approach or even grant making. So just to name at the beginning that the motivation was from a number of years back, really two sides of the same coin, with diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, with an intersectional lens as something that very much complemented and was related to in a fundamental way to participatory grant making. And so that led us to identifying as one of the outcomes for our philanthropy sector strategy in the US that we would see more awareness and adoption of participatory grant making within foundations in the US. And so for that, success would look like that we understand better the circumstances in which participatory approaches work best, that participatory models are more widely practiced, and that more funders adopt a mantra from the disability rights movement of do nothing about me without me, or do nothing about us without us, as a default norm. So as Cindy mentioned, to focus on the awareness end of things, we supported this monograph that Cindy wrote, and then the Grantcraft Guide. And one thing I'll note about that is that there was a starter framework that came out of the monograph that really looked at that synthesized a number of different frameworks that already existed out there, and just put sort of a simple way of putting this together that has these different components that folks see here: informing, consulting, involving, and deciding. And so that the deciding part is where the grant making happens. So just to convey, as many others have done, that there are multiple points of entry for doing more participation in philanthropy. And it's been great to see how this has been iterated on over the years. Justice Funders has added a 5th category of ceding decision-making power altogether, so transferring power. And you love to see that kind of iteration and that pushing of the field. So having done that kind of work on awareness and putting this publication and these frameworks out there, there was a challenge, right, of how to translate that into greater adoption. It felt like we had limited leverage internally to change the practices, within our own foundation or within other peers. So we started to ask ourselves, sort of what else could the foundation do in this area? And that goes to that moment that Cindy spoke to, that it sounded like from the research there was a lack of evidence showing the value and benefits and challenges and outcomes of participatory grant making in a way that would be compelling for larger foundations in particular. So we allocated some funds out of the philanthropy sector portfolio to fund some research and put together this process that Cindy mentioned. And it really was driven by a set of questions that came from the sector, that came from the field. Why should legacy foundations, larger foundations, care about participatory grant making? What value does it add? What are the costs of doing it or not doing it? How do we know we're doing it right? How do we define success? Is that the same way that grantees or communities would define it? And are the assumptions that practitioners make about the outcomes and benefits of participatory grant making correct? Does it lead to better outcomes for funders and for grantee partners? And do those outcomes differ and under what circumstances? And those are the questions that we really ended up getting into more through the research that we funded. So the panel that we put together had 3 different categories: folks who are practitioners of participatory grant making who had done the work themselves, practitioners and experts, including from academia, about the field of democracy and deliberative governance, which is very adjacent to participatory grant making and can inform it in an important way. And then finally, members of the target audience of some national funders, including myself on that, and then Cindy was our facilitator. Happy to go into further detail, and there's a longer deck that we can share afterwards that has, for those who are curious about the actual process, but this is sort of the overview. Basically, this took a year. The pre-process was a good 3 to 6 months, getting to the point where we could establish that advisory committee, which quickly renamed itself a steering committee in a move that I appreciated. And from that point, it was 6 months until the grant recommendations were made. It was punctuated by a couple of in-person meetings. The foundation provided stipends, travel funding, accommodation for people to come visit in New York, and meeting space here at the building in New York City. In between, the steering committee developed and disseminated the RFP and reviewed and made recommendations on the proposals themselves. And then we had a final grant decision-making meeting. Some stats on the numbers, just out of, again, it's from 2019, but it was interesting even at the time, before the participatory grant making community existed, and when it was sort of earlier in the cycle on this, we got 50 proposals that had an average request around 50,000 US, and a total of 2.8 million in requests, for which we had ultimately around 400,000 that we were able to give. So there was a lot of demand for this even then. I could only imagine there would be more now. So for any funders in the audience, hint, hint, plug, plug, to Cindy's point, there's still a lot of interest in documentation and research there. So the projects, as Cindy alluded to, had these 3 buckets, a few of them to do sort of mapping of the overall field, kind of documenting the practice across a variety of foundations. And we'll hear from Emily about the U of Washington study, about mapping the practice among the 200 largest US foundations, and then from Elizabeth with Women's Funding Network, looking among women's funds. And then at the follow-up webinar on July 13th, we'll hear from the other 2 categories, from Pride Foundation about their case study of a foundation considering a transition to starting to do participatory grant making, what they took from that, and then a couple of examples of longtime practitioners of this from Disability Rights Fund and New England Grassroots Environment Fund about what it meant to document that practice, what they learned from that reflection period, which is so rare, and in particular how it affects what they learned about how it affects their relationships with the social movements that they're connected to. So I'll wrap up by just mentioning that since that research was funded, obviously many things have changed. We've been in regular contact with the research teams. We had 2 virtual convenings, did a learning reflection on the Ford website that they co-authored. The teams have done articles and blog posts of their own along the way. We were very pleased to get an invitation from Georgetown University Press for a new series on philanthropy in the nonprofit sector that they're doing, to do an edited collection with them that would be in 23. A couple of the project team leads have joined the editorial team, and we're moving along with that. We're getting in drafts of those as we speak, so it's on track. And then here we are today doing these 2 webinars. So just to underline so that's where we are in that process, and definitely appreciate the chance to share back a little bit. Happy to speak more during the Q&A about that. I will pass it on to Emily to share a little bit about the overview that they developed through their research of what the practice actually looks like in other larger foundations in the US.
Thanks so much, Chris. Go ahead and share slides here. All right. So yeah, as Chris was saying, our research team, which included Kelly Husted, David Suarez, and myself, were really charged with kind of understanding the current landscape, getting a snapshot of what big foundations in the US are really doing as far as participatory approaches, not just participatory grant making, and what are some of the benefits and barriers that we're encountering. So we were motivated by this idea that, well, although we know a lot of the action of participatory grant making is really happening in foundations and nonprofits of the kind of public charity status, our focus was really on these large private and community foundations, about which there's currently many concerns about power and lack of accountability, and also kind of black box decision making. And so while these foundations exercise a lot of power and privilege to define problems and how they ought to be solved, there's really been a lot of pushback lately about sharing that power with those who have been historically marginalized. But our question was really, what is the actual current scope of participatory approaches among these large foundations? We wanted to know, what are the benefits and challenges that these foundations associate with participatory approaches? What's motivating them? What's keeping them from maybe moving this practice to the next level? And also, how do foundations think about evaluating participatory approaches? Participation, though, can be a really ambiguous concept, especially in the context of philanthropic practice. So we wanted to capture as much of the story as possible. We therefore, drawing on Cindy Gibson's work, drawing on that beginning framework, we conceptualize participation in this context along 3 dimensions. Who participates? External stakeholders like nonprofit grantees, communities directly affected by the foundation's funding, members of the public, and non-grantee nonprofits, as opposed to internal stakeholders, board, staff, executives. We asked, in what processes do these stakeholders participate? Determining organizational priorities, outlining grant-making processes, actually making funding decisions, or dealing in processes of post-grant evaluation. And then finally, what degree of power do these stakeholders actually have in influencing decision-making? Is it a unilateral flow of information in a sort of consultative or involving capacity, or are stakeholders actually being tapped to decide upon different elements of organizational process? In order to answer these questions, we used a sample of 500 of the largest private and community philanthropic foundations by total assets in the United States. So our median total assets from 2018 was around $500 million. We designed our survey instrument using our conceptual framework in consultation with practitioners. Ultimately, we wanted to make sure that these findings are actionable and that you can all take this information and use it for practices of advocacy or informing your own organizational practice. We distributed our survey electronically beginning in about mid-May 2020, so right as the COVID pandemic began. We ended up with a sample of 148 foundations for a response rate of around 30%. All right, I'm going to focus specifically today on the prevalence of what I would call kind of true power sharing. To what extent do foundations actually share decision-making power with external stakeholders? I will share the actual document, the full report in the chat window in just a second, so y'all can see how different processes rated. But again, we'll focus specifically on decision making here. We found that overall power sharing happens relatively infrequently with external stakeholders, but overall, we see that about 10% of foundations, I'm not sure why that's isolating focus just to 2 bars, but we'll move with it here. Around 10% of foundations reported giving decision-making authority over grant funding to grantees and communities directly affected. Roughly 8% of foundations reported giving decision-making authority over grant-making processes to their grantees, which can kind of be seen as a baby step towards addressing issues underlying that nonprofit starvation cycle. Interestingly, we found that most foundations report that the motivation for engaging external stakeholders was really the belief that it leads to more effective grant making and more innovative solutions to societal challenges. Somewhat surprisingly, less commonly reported reasons for engaging in this work were promoting social justice and equity and shifting power to affected communities, which we found a little bit surprising given that a lot of the literature that currently exists around participatory grant making is really emphasizing this democratizing and equity-focused ethos. Interestingly, again, we found that the most commonly reported challenge or barrier to doing this work was the lack of capacity to implement it within the foundation. Again, a little bit surprising here, given that our sampling frame is defined by their abundance of resources. Finally, we're really curious as to how foundations think about evaluating this work. And we found that most foundations, or around 70%, do not actually evaluate how stakeholder participation shapes governance or grant making outcomes. No process evaluation, no outcome evaluation. 40% of these foundations indicate that they're not actually interested in doing so. And again, a lack of capacity is the most oft-cited reason. Another issue, though, is the perceived lack of metrics to capture the deeper dynamics of stakeholder engagement and participation. One respondent tells us, we know evaluation is helpful to have, but sometimes it's splitting hairs. Is there a body of evidence to suggest that this is effective? How many neighbors have we reached out to? The bigger question is, do they trust us? And it's hard to measure that because it's not transactional. It's hard to really measure that deep sense of trust. So ultimately, going forward, this research raises more questions than it's answered. It's not just about what the current landscape looks like, but how can we move the field towards involving stakeholders in meaningful ways? So in order to do that, we seek to understand in the future, what does engaging stakeholders actually look like in practice for large foundations? Because again, we're just kind of getting a high-level overview. What drives utilization of participatory approaches in philanthropy? This is something my colleague Kelly Houston and I have already begun to work on in earnest. And then how can we reconcile this logic of evaluation with the logic of participation? Understanding there's this gap in thinking of the equity focus of participation versus the kind of positivist logic of evaluation. And finally, the holy grail, does it work? To what extent does participatory grant making improve the outcomes of grant making? This is just a window into the PGM puzzle. I'm looking really forward to discussing how this plays out at other levels as well. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Emily. I'll also share my screen here. And start the slideshow. Can everyone see that? Okay, great. Okay, so I'm thank you for that. It's kind kind of going on the heels of kind of thinking about what it means to map this ecosystem. As Chris mentioned, women's funds are one of the kind of early adopters, early kind of explorers of what it looks like to share power and share decision-making power. In fact, women's funds were, and WFN actually was founded in 1985 with the kind of initial kind of ethos that that philanthropy should be in the hands of those impacted, that the best solutions to the problems are local solutions, and that philanthropy should be something that is not only bringing in the voices of local actors, but actually that philanthropy is by and for those local actors. So definitely the ethos of participatory grant making is absolutely embedded in the work that the Women's Funds do. Just a quick overview of what Women's Funding Network is. We're in 36 states in the U.S. and D.C. And 14 countries and most regions in the world. In the U.S. alone, our members, the Women's Funds, impact about 39 million women and children below the 200% poverty level. So the impact that they're having in the states and in the areas that they're in, they're really reaching some of the most ignored or impacted communities in the areas where they live. And so this kind of again, we know that the Women's Funds have this history. We know that this network, we thought it was a really good kind of a snapshot again of this is a good time to be able to collect kind of what does this network actually look like when it comes to participatory grant making. It's again part of the ethos, but in many cases when you have an organization that has been around for 40 years, you tend to have some of these kind of, I want to say, myth kind of sharing, that there's these, that we know that it's happening, but there hasn't really been a concerted effort to map it, track it, and understand how it's evolved over the past 40 years. And also make sure that we're all speaking the same language. And as I know, in this group has often shared, what does participatory grant making mean? What does it look like? So this was a really tremendous opportunity to be able, again, to map this network and see exactly where 40 years has brought folks. And what we found that was really interesting, was interesting and that was expected, but it was nice to see that basically 100% of the women's funds that we surveyed did have some level of participatory grant making. About 75% would say that 100%, they were doing the full kind of scope of participatory grant making, full decision making, sharing, and all along those continuums that we've talked about before. About the other piece, that what was interesting is that kind of orange and gray slice there of 27% of the women's funds who in their response that they did not do participatory grant making. What we found there, which was interesting, is that a portion of those, more than half, actually did do some components of participatory grant making, again, along the continuum, but weren't kind of to the farthest end of the continuum that we look at. And then the other slice, that gray slice, were women's funds that didn't actually identify saying that the practices that they do are participatory grant making, but in fact had really evolved beyond that language. They had been doing this practice for a very long time and were actually deep in exploration around other types of democratizing practices that went well beyond grant making. And so that was also very interesting for us to map. Where we are now is thinking about really not losing the thread. It was way too long for us to be able to map where this practice was taking place in the network. Now that we have a really good kind of sense of what the network looks like and where they're at, we've actually deployed a internal way of collecting the data on an ongoing basis and having a really rigorous analysis of kind of how it's shifting, We also were collecting this data during the pandemic as well. So we really know that one of the things that makes this practice really special is because of that instant feedback. We know that the evolution is also happening really quickly. So you really can't, not only can you not wait 40 years, you really can't wait even a year. You really have to track it as it moves, as things are shifting. So we actually restructured some of our internal practices to be able to collect data real time and be able to paint the picture as it moves along. So that ongoing practice was something that we instituted after this research. The next piece is really thinking about instituting a community of practice within our network. And what that means is we knew that there were some women's funds that were in deep communication with each other about the practice and the approach of participatory grant making. But there wasn't, in the same way we hadn't documented what it looked like, there wasn't kind of a grouping, much like this network here, that can really talk about the challenges, share resources, and really reinforce with each other the new places that they were exploring. So that was something we also instituted within the network, is really brought together a regular monthly community of practice conversation where women's funds are now doing that, and we're recording it as well. So that's another way we're able to kind of keep tracking and doing that. Also, I know we talked about the evaluation, and that's something that the women's funds across the board, again, since nearly 100% of them are doing participatory grant making, they were all very concerned about this, not so much for themselves, but mainly for their stakeholders and their funders, how they're able to describe a practice that is so deeply a part of who they are as organizations, as funders, how to be able to demonstrate the effectiveness in some of those traditional philanthropy models. So evaluation was a key kind of question that a lot of them were sitting with. We actually started a new, from that, we started a new partnership with the Institute for Women's Policy Research and a new project called the Gender Point, a collaboration between that IWPR and WFN, really that as a unified platform to be able to start to track some of the key metrics that we know were a big part of all of our network, and be able to kind of create some levels of translation for philanthropy as a whole. So that was one piece. But another thing, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in the conversation, is we had a lot of the women's funds, especially the ones who were in that evolving practice phase, that were really kind of pushing back on this question of evaluation altogether. Really thinking about evaluation is not kind of how do we translate what we know is effective to the broader philanthropic sphere, but more along the lines of looking at evaluation itself as a way to, as transforming that into a democratizing practice, and actually a place of contestation around democracy and democratizing philanthropy. And that in and of itself, when you're asking questions about what to measure and what matters, that in and of itself is a power dynamic that needs to be explored within philanthropy. And that there are new practices that they are trying to initiate that really kind of turn this a little bit on its head. And not just looking at the grant making dollars as a place of shifting power, but looking at all of these different processes as opportunities to shift power, and looking at evaluation as one of those models. So that was, again, an interesting place for us as we're looking about how we now, as a network, are engaging in those conversations. One of the other biggest surprises around kind of between completing the mapping and the pandemic in 2020, 2021, and here where we are now, is that we actually as a network continue to invest in women's funds and the work that they were doing with the participatory grant making. What we found is that because the pandemic actually revealed a perfect test case for how PGM is, despite what some folks may say in terms of being very difficult and long to kind of initiate, it actually is a very agile practice when in the hands of masters, in the hands of people who have mastered it, not as a practice itself, but as all of the different things that involve the trust, all of the relationships, all of those pieces. When they're very mature, it can be an agile practice that held up really well during the pandemic and the chaos, quite frankly, chaos of the past 2 years. And so what we did is we actually invested directly in those funds who were doing that work to test whether or not kind of some additional funding towards that was in their grant making practices could reveal some new strategies on how to address what was going on during the pandemic. And what we saw was actually quite frankly extraordinary. Again, we saw the agile practices at work. We saw that they were able to leverage additional investment up to 10 times what we gave them. It was definitely, they were able to expand their liberatory practices they were already exploring because they just, again, really matched well to what was happening during the pandemic. So it was a surprise, but also we were kind of validates the theory in our curiosities around these approaches. So happy to explore more on that. And so kind of where we are now, we're really curious about how we expand these practices to different types of donors. We know, when we invest in the women's funds and what they're doing, again, in the hands of masters of this work, we know that they grow. We know that they have all these great outcomes. So we know it's just quite simply not enough. So how do we expand these practices in other types of donors, foundations, so we can really grow this practice in the field? I know that's what a lot of us are wrestling with. And the other place we're exploring is what are the other learning spaces for philanthropy where we can continue to have this conversation. So those are a couple of the places where we are now. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Really appreciate that. And both you and Emily have just opened up so many topics of conversation as are reflected in the chat. I wanted to pick up on one thread that came up a little while ago in the chat and even the presentation, the idea of the logic of evaluation versus the logic of participation. That's such an evocative phrase. What does that mean to each of you?
I'll just jump in here. What kind of motivated that question is this kind of really positivist frame of evaluation, the logic modeling, the true blue randomized impact evaluation, the focus on those really kind of professionalized tools, right? That necessitate a certain body of knowledge in order to incorporate to the level that they become meaningful. Versus the logic of participation here, which is really more about giving power, not giving power back, returning power to those who have been historically marginalized. And there's such a disconnect here. And I don't believe there needs to be, but we can see in some of our results that there is a little bit of this disconnect of like, well, that level of participation of true power sharing is not really what we do. It's not really how our organizational model works, because our organizational model is so centered around proving effectiveness or that kind of notion of accountability.
Yeah. How about for you, Elizabeth?
Thank you. I think the way we've been talking about it is really trying to get at the core of what evaluation is, in that it's in many ways we've taken it for granted that it's about accountability, and in the tools of philanthropy, it's often used as it's used as power, used as a way to be able to kind of wield a power and also suppress organizations that don't have that kind of professionalized, I really want to say academic background to be able to think about evaluation in that way. We're really thinking about, at the core, isn't evaluation about education? Isn't it about educating the learning, isn't it about learning? If we really get at the core of it, take away the power piece, it's about understanding what happened and and learning from it. And evaluation, he's put in another, other type of, like, you think about agile or these other types of business types of pieces, you really look at it as a part of a process where you're learning from what happened and incorporating it into a new piece. But we've taken it away from the learning sphere and turned it into almost exclusively in the power sphere. And so if you're thinking about evaluation as learning, what we're curious about is what would learning from the communities most effective look like? You would stop thinking about evaluation as a dirty word. You would actually start looking at it from a place of deep opportunity to be able to really learn from the field. It would be about voices. It would be about engagement. It would be about participation. That's what it would look like. And so we're really, again, we don't see it as bifurcated at all. We don't see it as or mutually exclusive. We really see it as we actually do need to kind of come back to the core of, what it is you're actually thinking about when you talk about evaluation. And I think at that place, the accountability shows up in that a mirror, in a way, for philanthropy to really be able to see, well, this is really about power, actually. It's not really about learning, and be able to really identify what the core of how they're using this tool.
Yeah. For me, what it brings up is, in addition to what you all have said, is the fact that we're at a moment where, from a number of different points of entry, folks are rethinking, renegotiating the way that power operates within institutional philanthropy, right? And it has different labels, and there are different communities that have coalesced around those points of entry, whether it's the Equitable Evaluation Initiative, which has a lot of deep work on all of this about the, fancy words like epistemological roots of evaluation and how those are steeped in, dominant colonialist mindsets and all of that. As this community has done work on, trust-based philanthropy relative to participatory grant making, back to sort of where we started on this with our philanthropy sector portfolio, all of the work around DEI and racial equity and intersectionality, right? Like in philanthropic practice, we saw those, our motivation was those are two sides of the same coin about how you have closer relationships and less of a gap between philanthropic decision makers. So I from the reflecting on the arc of time since the research started, it feels like each of those communities has burgeoned. And there's so many more people working on them alongside folks who've been doing it for a long time. So there's just, there are rich bodies of knowledge and communities of practice out there that are all, I think of them as doors going to the same big room, right? Where we are all free, right? Where power is distributed in a more equitable way in society, and things are more democratized more generally. And we're sort of each milling around in our part of the antechamber to that. And be nice to talk amongst ourselves in the antechamber a little bit more, because there's just a lot to be learned from each other. We each have like I said, a different point of entry on that. The other thing that's standing out for me about the past few years, and I owe this sort of methodology to this framework to a colleague, we've learned a lot about what it takes for foundations to actually change. And they have, in ways that Emily and your team, you've documented have and haven't, right? And that nuance is always really important. But external pressure really makes a difference, right? Whether it's from advocacy or whether, and that can be within the foundation as well, from external groups or just the pressure of circumstances of an urgent public health crisis, a pandemic, racial justice uprisings that require a response. To your point about agility, Elizabeth, a lot of foundations have proved themselves really agile in ways that for those advocating for such changes would have felt impossible, even a few years ago. Saw someone who's been working in this field for a while say, there's been in early 2020 that there's been more movement in the past month on more flexible funding than there had been in the past decade. And, there's also a moment where folks are starting to think, and within the halls of individual foundations, folks are starting to wonder, like, is that period over? Do we go sort of back to what we were doing before? So this feels like a real moment where sustained conversation in the field, engagement in these types of communities, pressure about not going back to those prior ways, which were so much about control, right? We've talked about power, but so much of this is about control, and the need to reflect on these various experiences that we've had over the last 2-3 years and what they mean for what it looks like to let go of as much control over defining the strategy, defining the metrics of evaluation, being the decision makers on grant making. A lot more to be discussed there, but it does feel like there's a moment to frame the conversation in a different way than we've been having it.
Just to piggyback on that, absolutely. The idea of keeping the conversation going, I've found in this work and also in other work that looks at relationships between foundations or funders in general and nonprofit grantees and communities. When the pandemic first hit, we saw an incredible movement and very much a demonstration of the potential agility of institutional philanthropy in creating flexible funding structures, talking to grantees more proposively, developing relationships, really asking the questions of what can we do for you and how can we work with you in community to make situations better. It was right at the outset of the pandemic. Unfortunately, but somewhat predictably, we've seen a little bit of backtracking, especially in Washington State among nonprofits in Washington State and their relationships. We've seen movement back towards old notions of accountability, demonstrating what our foundation can do to the broader public rather than demonstrating, hey, we're listening to you as grantees, as communities, as folks who have expertise that we do not have. So I'm very fascinated by this question of how can we keep momentum moving forward, trying to push for more of this notion of evaluation as a learning process in the way that Elizabeth has laid it out. I'm really such a provocative and such an important idea.
Thanks. See that there's a hand up from EPG Port, I guess is the screen name that I see. Hey, Dennis. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, I was on mute. Interesting conversation, and I see we only have a few minutes left, but I can't resist maybe to throw in a bit of a provocative view a little bit. What I feel about this conversation is that is as if evaluation and participation are mutually exclusive. They can never be combined, and that I think would be a great pity. And I feel we're heading a bit in a direction that we don't need to go. For instance, if some people are asking about who decides which progress indicators to assess, and several people have mentioned it, and Cynthia put it on the chat. Absolutely correct. But then the effectiveness of participatory grant making, and many funders and many people would want to understand why this is. I think it would be fantastic to know more about it, because you can make a much stronger case and get more money to do your work, right? So people will continue to ask about it if we don't document it in that kind of way. So evaluation can be done in many different ways. There are all kinds of ways to do evaluation, and it need not to be always experimental design or randomized control trials. I know many people don't like it. I'm also quite critical of them, but sometimes this can be very helpful. But evaluation can be in so many other different kinds of ways. But I think it's important that we don't start throwing questions at the table and make them sound like the difficult questions. First, you resolve this, and then let's talk about evaluation. It's not like that. You can have an evaluation look like whatever way you want. And yes, the foundations, including Portuguese, for instance, should not dictate what constitutes ceding power and what participation means. You can set up an evaluation in a very participatory fashion with those people who will be part of the evaluation. They help to decide all the questions, the metrics, and all the rest of it, even participatory approaches. They can participate even in evaluation by itself. But still, again, I can't help it but think it would still be very important to try and build that evidence, that body of evidence that shows that participatory grant making is effective. And if we can't show that, the questions will keep coming. And I think it's too easy for us, and I don't think it's very helpful for us to judge that question to dodge the question, to try and hide it by every time talking about the fact that, well, who decides this? What about that? What about the process? What about ceding power here and there? Yes, all that can be part of the intervention about how you decide, how the intervention is being evaluated. But let's not do as if these two cannot be married. Sorry about that. I couldn't resist making that point.
Not at all. I love the conversation and the provocation, Dennis. And I see Diana's question in the chat. That really is a takeaway for me from the last 2-3 years. Interrogating that very question is a part of how we get to that greater understanding, because effectiveness for whom, with regard to what, and with regard to whose outcomes, right? Like if the value of participation is building relationships and social capital and learning among the folks who participate, that may be that is a vision of effectiveness that is not as tied to are the grants made to any different types of organizations or larger or smaller organizations, or does it take longer? This is ultimately a contestation of power about who gets to define what effectiveness means in philanthropy. And it's an ongoing conversation and a live one, and one that we need to hear lots of different perspectives on. And I really respect the point of view that wants to know more about in what circumstances does it work well or less well, right? And I think that that's what I'm looking forward to in the next conversation, sort of 3 examples of organizations work embedded with different kinds of social movements, LGBTQ rights, environmental justice, and disability rights and justice. And in those contexts, what does effectiveness for them look like? What does participation do or not do to advance their goals and what they're viewing as effectiveness? And so I look forward to that conversation as a funder, engage with those groups in different ways of like, what difference does it make for your effectiveness? And that gives me a different way of thinking about the effectiveness of resources that we provide or that other funders provide to it. So absolutely agreed that what makes a difference in what circumstances, there's so much more to be learned about that. And it's just going to continue to be a fundamentally contested question about who gets to decide what effectiveness is. So let's keep generating more answers, because you're right, it's not to dodge the conversation, but to add to and multiply the answers that we have to that key question.
Thanks so much, Chris. We are almost at time. Excellent chat as ever. I've enjoyed both the kind of verbal conversation, but also the written chat has been really engaging, which has been wonderful and demonstrates kind of the interest in the sector. I want to say a huge thank you to Elena, who's been helping with the tech in the background, Shanice, who's kind of been orchestrating all of this for us, Chris, Elizabeth, Emily, and Cindy. Thank you so much for insights. I'm really excited about the next one, and hopefully you can all join us on the I want to say 13th of July. That's correct. My COVID brain, time, maths and dates is totally out of the window, so I'm glad I've got that one right. Thank you so much, everybody. Elena's put that link in the chat, so if you do want to sign up for that next session, please do. And have a lovely rest of the day, regardless of what time it is. I think I'm about to clock off, which is wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.